In a quiet Mexican village, a young couple's intoxicating romance captivated everyone who knew them. Diego Alvarez and Camila Rivera seemed destined for a life of happiness, their love radiating like the summer sun. But beneath their vows and smiles lay a hidden truth, one that would ignite a storm of betrayal and rage. When Diego uncovered Camila's past, their idyllic love story turned into a nightmare of violence and heartbreak, leaving a community stunned and questioning whatever happened. How could love turn into tragedy so quickly, and who is truly to be blamed? The town of Jalapa, nestled in the lush, tropical region of Veracruz, Mexico, was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. Its cobblestone streets, flanked by colorful colonial buildings, wound through a community where everyone knew everyone else. Jalapa thrived on tradition, festivals, family ties, and the simple rhythms of life. It was a town where trust and reputation were the currency of everyday existence. Diego Alvarez was a humble man, a farmer whose hands were stained from years of labor, but whose heart remained tender. At age 28, Diego was admired by the Jalapa most. To them, he's a man of integrity, deeply rooted in the values passed down by his family. He worked tirelessly every day, cultivating crops and dreams of a family he could one day call his own. Diego was handsome in a rugged, unpolished way, with dark eyes that carried a quiet intensity. Yet, for all his virtues, love was far from him until Camila Rivera arrived in town. Camila was filled with mystery, a fathom of beauty and sophistication who seemed out of place in Jalapa's quiet simplicity. She had moved to the town 2 years earlier, claiming to seek a fresh start after the death of her parents in a tragic car accident. Camila quickly became the object of fascination among the townspeople. Her long black hair, porcelain skin, and radiant smile made her unforgettable, but it was her charm, her ability to weave her way into hearts with grace and ease, that set her apart. Diego first met Camila at the annual Festival de la Flor. She had been standing under a canopy of marigolds, her laughter ringing out like music, drawing Diego's attention from across the plaza. He was captivated. That night, he found the courage to approach her, and their connection was in an instant. Camila's stories of travel and adventure surprised and excited Diego, whose life had been confined to the boundaries of Jalapa. She, in turn, was drawn to his honesty and unwavering commitment to his family and work. Their courtship was in a twinkle of an eye, passionate, and filled with the promise of a life together. Diego, who had always been cautious in matters of the heart, found himself swept up in Camila's world. She seemed perfect. Too perfect, perhaps, but as they said, love is blind. Within a year, Diego proposed, and Camila said yes. The town rejoiced, seeing in them the embodiment of romance and hope. The wedding was a grand one, as vibrant as the community itself. The ceremony took place in the town's historic church, a place where generations of families had pledged their vows. Camila, dressed in a lace gown that seemed to shimmer in the candlelight, looked like a vision. Diego couldn't take his eyes off her, his heart swelling with love. But even as they exchanged vows, a shadow lingered in Camila's eyes. The weight of a secret she had carried for years, a secret that could destroy everything she had built. Camila had convinced herself that her past was behind her, buried beneath her. Yet, deep down, she knew that secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully they are hidden. The first weeks of their marriage were a dream. Diego and Camila settled into a small but cozy home on the outskirts of town, surrounded by fields of sugarcane that stretched to the horizon. Diego would rise early each morning, heading to the fields, while Camila tended to their home. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, sharing stories, and planning for a future filled with children and prosperity. To Diego, Camila seemed like the perfect wife. She was attentive, supportive, and endlessly charming. But cracks began to appear, subtle at first, like the faint lines on an aging photograph. Camila avoided certain topics, especially those concerning her past. When Diego asked about her childhood, she would deflect, steering the conversation elsewhere. The first major red flag came one afternoon when Diego stumbled upon an old photograph while organizing their home. It was tucked inside a book, a faded image of a young boy, no older than 10, smiling shyly at the camera. The boy's features bore a striking resemblance to Camila, enough to pique Diego's curiosity. When he asked her about it, Camila grew visibly tense, brushing off the question with a vague explanation about a distant cousin. Diego's unease grew. He began to notice inconsistencies in Camila's stories, small details that didn't add up. She claimed to have grown up in Monterrey, but her accent and mannerisms suggested otherwise. She spoke of a close-knit family, yet never seemed to communicate with any relatives. Diego waved off his suspicions as paranoia, unwilling to tarnish the image of the woman he loved, but the seeds of doubt had been planted, and they began to take root. The turning point came during a family gathering at Diego's parents' home. Camila, who had always been poised and composed, seemed unusually anxious. When Diego's mother asked about her plans for children, Camila's smile faltered, her response awkward. Diego noticed, as did his family, though no one pressed the matter further. That night, as they walked home, Diego asked Camila why she had been so uncomfortable. Her response was vague, a mixture of excuses that failed to satisfy his growing curiosity. Something wasn't right, and Diego knew it. A few days later, while cleaning their bedroom, Diego discovered a locked box hidden in Camila's closet. His heart raced as he searched for the key, finally finding it placed inside her jewelry case. If you have watched this moment, that means you are enjoying the documentary. Why not subscribe to our channel to have better access to more interesting stories just like this one? Inside were documents, birth certificates, medical records, and letters detailing a life Diego hadn't known existed. Among them was a birth certificate for a male child named Javier Rivera. Diego's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing: the boy in the photograph, the inconsistencies in Camila's stories, her guarded nature. Camila, the woman he had married, the woman he had dreamed of building a life with, had been born Javier. The revelation hit Diego like a tidal wave, a mix of shock, anger, and confusion that left him reeling. He felt betrayed, as though the foundation of his love had been built on a lie. He confronted Camila that night, his emotions boiling over as he demanded answers. Camila, cornered and terrified, confessed. She told him everything: the surgeries, the transition of herself as the woman she had always known she was. She pleaded with Diego to understand, to see that she was still the same person he had fallen in love with. But for Diego, the betrayal was too much to bear. His world, his identity, his very sense of self had been upended. The love he had felt so deeply was now entangled with anger and a profound sense of loss. That night, their marriage crossed a line from which it would never return. Diego wandered the darkened streets of Xalapa that night, his emotions ricocheting between anger, confusion, and betrayal. The revelation had left him unmoored, a man who no longer recognized the life he thought was his. He replayed the moment he had discovered the truth, every detail of Camila's confession echoing in his mind, her trembling voice, the tears streaming down her face, her desperate attempts to make him see her as the same person she had always been. It was all too much. To Diego, this wasn't just about a secret. It felt like an attack on his identity, his masculinity, and his trust. He had married her, given her his heart, his future, and his family's acceptance, only to discover that everything was built on a foundation of lies. His love for her, once so pure and unwavering, was now tangled in anger and disbelief. When he finally returned home at dawn, Camila was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes swollen and red. She had spent the night waiting for him to return, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her carefully constructed world was crumbling. She looked at Diego with a mixture of hope and fear, silently pleading for forgiveness and understanding. Diego, however, couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. He couldn't reconcile the woman he had loved so fiercely with the person who had lied to him about something so fundamental. He sat across from her, his body tense and his hands clenched into fists. The silence between them was suffocating, heavy with words left unspoken. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in their home became unbearable. Diego withdrew into himself, throwing his energy into the fields and avoiding Camila whenever possible. She, in turn, tried to reach out, to explain herself, to remind him of the love they had shared. But Diego couldn't hear her through the storm of his emotions. The townspeople began to notice the change in Diego. His usual jovial behavior had been replaced by a somber silence. Friends and family asked him what was wrong, but he brushed off their concerns, unwilling to expose Camilla's secret. Despite his anger, he couldn't bring himself to shame her publicly. Yet, the weight of carrying the truth alone began to erode him from the inside out. Camilla, for her part, found herself increasingly isolated. The vibrant, confident woman who had once captivated the town was now a shadow of herself. She avoided public gatherings, terrified that someone might uncover her past. Her only solace came from the letters she wrote late at night, pouring out her thoughts and emotions in the hopes that Diego might one day read them and understand. One evening, after a particularly stressful day in the fields, Diego returned home to find a letter on the kitchen table. It was from Camilla, detailing her journey from Javier to the woman she had become. She described what she's been through, the pain of rejection, and the triumph of finally becoming her true self. She wrote about how meeting Diego had been the happiest moment of her life, and how she had never intended to deceive him. As Diego read the letter, he felt a flicker of compassion beneath his anger. For the first time he glimpsed the depth of Camilla's pain and the courage it had taken for her to live as her authentic self. Yet, even this newfound understanding couldn't erase the betrayal he felt. That night, the two of them sat together for the first time since the truth had come to light. Camilla tried once more to explain, to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. She spoke of her love for Diego, her hope that they could move past this and build a future together. Diego listened, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. But as much as he wanted to forgive her, to find a way forward, he couldn't. The wounds were too fresh, the betrayal too deep. He told her as much, his voice breaking with the weight of his words. Camilla, devastated, realized that no amount of explanation could mend what had been broken. The next day, Diego went to see Father Mateo, the town's priest, seeking guidance. Father Mateo listened patiently as Diego poured out his heart, his voice thick with emotion. The priest, a man known for his wisdom and compassion, urged Diego to consider forgiveness, not just for Camilla, but for himself. Holding on to anger, he warned, would only poison Diego's soul. Diego left the church feeling no closer to an answer. Forgiveness felt impossible, but so did the thought of continuing to live with the bitterness consuming him. He began to spiral, drinking heavily in an attempt to numb his emotions. The man who had once been the pride of Xalapa was now a ghost of himself, haunted by the life he had lost. As Diego's behavior grew more erratic, Camilla became increasingly fearful. She tried to give him space, hoping that time might heal the wounds between them. But Diego's anger festered, growing darker with each passing day. One fateful evening, the tension between them reached its breaking point. Diego returned home drunk, his emotions boiling over. He confronted Camilla, his words slurred but filled with venom. He accused her of ruining his life, of making him the subject of a betrayal he couldn't escape. Camilla tried to calm him, to defuse the situation, but her attempts only seemed to enrage him further. What happened next remains a mystery. Filled with rage, Diego grabbed a kitchen knife, his anger spilling over into violence. Camilla, desperate to protect herself, tried to fight back, but she was no match for Diego's fury. When it was over, she lay lifeless on the kitchen floor, the life they had built together shattered beyond repair. Diego, horrified by what he had done, staggered back, the knife falling from his hands. The reality of his actions hit him like a freight train, and he realized that there was no undoing what had been done. Panicked, he fled the house, leaving behind the woman he had once loved and the dream they had shared. The town of Xalapa awoke the next morning to the shocking news. Camilla's body had been discovered by a neighbor, and the authorities quickly launched an investigation. Diego, now a criminal, was nowhere to be found. The community was left reeling, grappling with the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst. The story of Diego and Camilla, which was once a tale of love and hope, had become a cautionary tale about the destructive power of secrets and the devastating consequences of unresolved anger. For the people of Xalapa, it was a reminder that even the most idyllic lives can hide shadows, and that the truth, no matter how painful, must always come to light. The sun rose over Xalapa, casting an eerie calm over a town that had been thrown into turmoil. Word spread quickly of Camilla's tragic death, and Diego's disappearance. Neighbors gathered in hushed clusters, exchanging fragments of information, their faces etched with shock and sorrow. Xalapa was a small community where everyone knew each other, and the idea that such a horrific event had unfolded among them was unfathomable. The authorities arrived at the couple's home shortly after the neighbor reported the crime. The scene they encountered was one of chaos and violence, a stark contrast to the warm, inviting home that Diego and Camila had shared. Blood stained the kitchen tiles, and the room seemed frozen in the aftermath of a struggle. Investigators immediately began piecing together the events of the previous night. Diego's absence was damning. To the police, it was clear he had fled in the aftermath of the crime, but tracking him down in the rugged terrain surrounding Xalapa was a challenge. Search parties combed through the sugarcane fields and forested hills, but Diego seemed to have vanished without a trace. Back in town, the news ignited a firestorm of gossip and speculation. Camila's past, once a secret, became the focus of whispered conversations. People debated whether Diego's actions were driven by the revelation of her identity, their opinions polarized by prejudice and misunderstanding. Some defended Diego, claiming that he had been pushed to his breaking point. Others condemned him, insisting that nothing could justify such a brutal act. Among those struggling to make sense of the tragedy was Diego's younger sister, Sofia. She had always looked up to her brother as a kind and honorable man, and the idea that he could commit such a violent crime was incomprehensible. But as she delved into the details of his relationship with Camila, she began to see the cracks that had formed beneath the surface. Sofia visited the church to speak with Father Mateo, hoping for guidance. The priest, who had counseled Diego in the days leading up to the crime, shared his own sorrow and frustration. He told Sofia about Diego's struggle with forgiveness and the weight of the secret he had uncovered. Father Mateo emphasized that Diego's actions, while abhorrent, were the result of a storm of emotions he hadn't been equipped to handle. The tragedy also weighed heavily on Camila's closest friend, Isabella. She had been one of the few people who knew Camila's full story, and she had supported her through the challenges of transitioning and building a new life. Isabella was devastated by the loss of her friend, and she felt an overwhelming sense of guilt for not doing more to protect her. Isabella decided to honor Camila's memory by sharing her story with the community. She spoke about the courage it had taken for Camila to live as her authentic self and the love she had shared with Diego despite the challenges they faced. Isabella's words struck a chord with many in the community, forcing them to confront their own biases and assumptions. As the days turned into weeks, the search for Diego continued. The authorities expanded their efforts, distributing wanted posters and seeking assistance from neighboring towns. Despite their best efforts, Diego remained missing. Some speculated that he had fled to another part of Mexico, while others believed he might have taken his own life in the wake of his actions. Meanwhile, the town of Xalapa struggled to move forward. The vibrant streets seemed muted, weighed down by the collective grief and shock. Camila's funeral was a somber affair, attended by a mix of mourners who had loved and supported her, and those. Sofia, determined to find answers, began her own search for Diego. She couldn't believe that her brother, despite his flaws, would simply vanish without a word. She retraced his steps, speaking with his friends, colleagues, and anyone who might have seen him. Her determination became a beacon of hope for the family, who were desperate to understand what had driven Diego to such a dark place. One evening, weeks after the tragedy, Sofia received a call from a man claiming to have seen Diego in a remote village several miles away. The man described a disheveled figure who had been working odd jobs in exchange for food and shelter. Sofia immediately contacted the authorities, and a small team set out to investigate the lead. When they arrived in the village, they found Diego living in a small shack on the outskirts of town. He looked like a shadow of his former self, thin, unkempt, and haunted. He didn't resist when the authorities approached him, his expression one of resignation. Diego was arrested and brought back to Xalapa, where he faced a community that had been forever changed by his actions. The trial that followed was a spectacle, drawing attention from across the region. The courtroom was packed with spectators, each eager to witness the unraveling of a story that had captivated their imaginations. During the trial, Diego's defense focused on the psychological toll of Camila's revelation and the intense emotions it had triggered. They argued that he had acted in a moment of blind rage, driven by feelings of betrayal and confusion. The prosecution, however, painted a picture of premeditated violence, emphasizing the brutality of the crime and the impact it had on the community. As the trial unfolded, more details about Diego and Camila's relationship came to light. Witnesses described their early days of happiness and the growing tension that had emerged in the weeks leading up to the crime. The letters Camila had written were presented as evidence, offering a heartbreaking glimpse into her perspective and her desperate hope for reconciliation. The trial lasted for several weeks, and by the end, the jury was faced with a difficult decision. Diego's actions were undeniably horrific, but the circumstances surrounding the crime were complex and emotionally charged. In the end, Diego was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. For the people of Xalapa, the conclusion of the trial brought a sense of closure, but also left lingering questions. Could the tragedy have been prevented if Diego had sought help earlier? What role did societal prejudices play in fueling the tension between him and Camila? And how could the community move forward in the wake of such a devastating loss? In the years that followed, Camila's story became a symbol of resilience and the fight for acceptance. Isabella continued to share her friend's story, advocating for greater understanding and support for marginalized communities. Father Mateo used the tragedy as a teaching moment, urging his congregation to embrace compassion and forgiveness. Diego, serving his sentence in a distant prison, spent his days reflecting on the choices that had led him down such a dark path. He wrote letters to Sofia, expressing his remorse and his hope that one day he might find redemption. The story of Diego and Camila remained a cautionary tale in Xalapa, a reminder of the destructive power of secrets and the importance of empathy. Though their love had ended in tragedy, it left behind a legacy of lessons that continued to shape the community for years to come. Did you think Camila Rivera deserved the treatment she received from Diego Alvarez? Was she supposed to die? If you think she doesn't deserve it, then subscribe to the channel. But if you think she did deserve it, then also subscribe to the channel. Either way, I want to hear your thoughts in the comment section.